Ukraine has done something that could shift the balance in the Asia-Pacific in South Korea's favor, something neither China nor North Korea will like. Because what Kiev is doing for Seoul is fundamentally changing the balance of power from the Taiwan Strait to the Korean Peninsula, and even in the Baltic region, by creating a major problem for China, North Korea, and Russia. The method is really simple. Neutralize expensive armies with cheap drones. Same as Russia and China. But users qualify and technology very important here. And the country applying that playbook most boldly is South Korea, is training 500,000 drone warriors to counter China and North Korea. But what really frightens Beijing and Pyongyang isn't that number, it's how to stop the massive drone armies they've got. On June 26th, South Korean Defense Minister Ahn Gyu-back unveiled the new doctrine. The drone is no longer the specialized kit of a few elite units, but a second personal weapon carried by every soldier. The target figure equals the country's entire active army, 500,000 operators. The aim is not to hand drones to a few units, but to turn nearly everyone in uniform into an operator. And it does not stop there. By 2030, more than 20,000 low-cost attack drones, AI-assisted swarms, and homegrown long-range munitions will join the force. Part of the reason for a move this radical lies in a humiliating night a few years ago. That night, 5 small North Korean drones crossed the South Korean border, one of them entering restricted airspace near the presidential office. The South scrambled jets and helicopters, fired hundreds of rounds, and not one of the 5 was brought down. A country with one of the world's most advanced air defenses stood helpless in a single night against targets worth a few $1,000s. Part of why Seoul is now turning to a cheap counter-drone layer traces back to that night. At the heart of the decision is a single choice. Korea will build these systems with 100% domestic components without a single Chinese part. Filling an army with drones is a question of scale. Doing it China-free is an entirely strategic choice. And the plan has a leg most reports overlook, which is actually the crucial one. To bring those drones down, it also builds lasers, high-power microwave systems, and low-cost interceptor drones. Seoul is building a drone army and a counter-drone army at the same time. The source of this whole transformation is not Seoul. It is the Ukrainian front, thousands of kilometers to the west. The lesson everyone knows is on offense. At the start of the war, Ukraine had no navy to speak of, and on paper stood no chance against the Black Sea Fleet. Even so, it put roughly a third of that fleet, including the flagship, out of action with cheap naval and aerial drones. The core of the lesson is one sentence. If a $500 drone can threaten a target worth millions, the entire math of building an expensive military is turned upside down. But most analysis stops here, and this is exactly where it misses the real lesson. Attacking with cheap drones is only half the equation. The other half, the half that actually decides the war, is how those swarms are met. That is, defense. What Ukraine really showed is this. You stop a drone swarm not by producing a bigger swarm, but by neutralizing it cheaply and en masse. And the cost of that is low. Ukraine's Sky Fortress acoustic sensor network is the proof. Roughly 14,000 sensors, a total cost under $10 million, nearly impossible to jam, and highly effective at detecting low-flying drones. Thanks to that cheap detection network, Ukraine reached interception rates above 95% in some attacks. Add electronic warfare that severs the drone's control link, plus cheap interceptor drones, and what emerges is a cheap defense against a cheap attack. This is where the real military balance of the 21st century is being set. Cheap drones equalize the attack, but the move that wins the war is being able to stop that cheap attack just as cheaply. And that is bad news for anyone whose edge rests on the swarm. Apply that lesson to 2 names, and the real panic appears. Kim Jong-un's card was clear: the partnership with Russia and the experience gained at the front. North Korea pushed its troops and weapons into the war on Russia's side. It entered, from a standing start, a front where electronic warfare, drone reconnaissance, and one-way attack systems are used at industrial scale. On that front, it lived the terror of drones firsthand. It learned how to use them, and perhaps how to stop them. And Moscow's sharing of Ukrainian drone wreckage gave it the chance to copy the designs. Xi Jinping's card was even bigger: numbers and production. China produces the lion's share of the world's commercial drones. When it comes to cheap and plentiful drones, no one can compete with it. On paper, an overwhelming advantage, but the Ukrainian front targeted precisely those two cards at once. Russia too relied on numbers, mass, and experience, and Ukraine showed that none of these is enough on its own. The decisive factor was how the incoming drone swarm was met. Striking with the right drone at the right time to destroy, at the lowest cost, an enemy asset worth many times more, and, just as importantly, melting that swarm en masse with a cheap defense. China's real gap is here. China produces drones, but it has no combat-tested experience of what happens when those drones hit a real counter-drone wall on a real front. A swarm is a weapon only when the other side cannot stop it cheaply, and this is exactly the opening the countries in the region see. South Korea, Taiwan, or Japan have no need to produce as many drones as China. The only thing they must do is build the cheap mass neutralization system Ukraine demonstrated. And here, South Korea holds a card most countries lack: a heavy defense industrial and technological base. Because South Korea is no longer an ordinary buyer, it is one of the world's largest arms exporters. It sells K-9 howitzers, K-2 tanks, its own K-F-21 fighter, and missile defense systems to dozens of countries. Its order book has surpassed $72 billion, and the country aims to become one of the world's top 4 arms exporters by 2030. More importantly, it can build weapons fast, cheaply, and largely on its own soil, without foreign dependence. On top of that, it is developing AI-assisted, loyal wingman drones, and, the very thing this video is about, directed energy weapons such as lasers and high-power microwave systems. In other words, South Korea already has the industrial and technological power to build the defense that melts an incoming drone swarm cheaply. And that raises a powerful possibility. South Korea may push this counter-drone technology further than Iran, China, or Russia, even further than Ukraine and Turkey. It could take the lesson Ukraine found on the battlefield and, with its own advanced electronics and chip industry, carry it to a new level. What truly devalues Xi's numerical edge and Kim's battlefield experience is exactly this rising defensive capability on the other side. And what turns the picture into a genuine nightmare for Xi is that this is not happening on a single front. The same Ukrainian lesson is being read right now in 2 separate geographies at once. On one side, Eastern Europe, Poland, the Baltics, and the Nordic countries are arming rapidly against Russia, and they buy a significant share of those arms from South Korea. On the other, the Pacific. Korea, Taiwan, and Japan are building the same cheap asymmetry against China. So a single lesson born on the Ukrainian front is hardening both Russia's and China's perimeters at the same time, and South Korea sits at the very intersection of these 2 fronts, the country that both equips Europe's front line and builds its own wall in the Pacific. What Beijing and Pyongyang see is not a single rival, but a whole generation developing cheap, smart moves against their own weak points, using what was learned in Ukraine. This is not one country's decision, it is a shared template being woven around China, and at its center is always the same logic: cheap offense plus cheap defense. The most visible place is Taiwan. The only realistic path for China to take the island by force is a massive, expensive amphibious landing across the 160-kilometer strait. Thousands of vehicles, ships, and troops in open water for days unprotected. This is precisely where the Ukrainian model is the antidote, because there are few things easier to hunt than a large, slow target in open water. That is what makes an amphibious landing so fragile. By nature, it is dense, slow, and predictable. Forces must mass in a narrow corridor and head for specific beaches in a specific order. So the defender knows roughly where and when to look. US Indo-Pacific Commander Admiral Paparo summed up the idea in one word: hellscape. If Beijing attacks, turning the strait into a nightmare full of unmanned systems, and in his words, making the Chinese military's task a month of pure misery. The inspiration is openly Ukraine. One caveat is essential here. Hellscape is not yet a proven, guaranteed recipe for victory on the battlefield. It is a concept. But Taiwan is building its plans on exactly this logic. Taiwan plans to acquire up to 200,000 drones over the next decade. in the air, on the sea, and underwater. The aim is to stop the Chinese military at the water's edge before it ever sets foot on the island. The porcupine strategy, discussed for decades but always deemed too expensive, is finally becoming feasible with cheap drones. Korea and Japan are looking the same way. Defense experts in the region, assuming that in a conflict North Korea would apply the drone warfare it learned on the Russia-Ukraine front, recommend that Seoul and Tokyo build a layered counter-drone defense. Jammers that sever the control link, cheap acoustic detection networks, interceptor drones, and close-in defense systems. So the military core of this picture is not to compete on numbers, it is to build the wall that neutralizes the incoming numbers cheaply. In May 2026, South Korea and the United States signed a letter of intent on drone and counter-drone systems to establish a joint supply chain and develop shared standards for allied forces. The relationship with Ukraine is more cautious but alive. Korean defense startups are seeking ways to benefit from Ukrainian companies' battle-tested technologies and their rapid feedback loop. There is not yet a formal technology transfer agreement between the two countries. Seoul is being careful about the escalation risk from both North Korea and Russia. But the direction is clear. Ukraine's battlefield lessons are turning through an ally, and this picture has a side that faces Moscow too. Whether South Korea will send lethal weapons directly to Ukraine is uncertain, one of the most sensitive items on the table, but transferring defensive systems is far more likely than lethal ones. And one thing is certain, Seoul is already giving this technology to Eastern Europe. The states along the front line facing Russia are equipping their defenses largely with Korean-made systems. For Putin, the meaning is heavy. The cheap defense logic born on his own front is now passing, through Seoul, into the hands of the states on his western border. So the door Ukraine opened is squeezing not only Beijing and Pyongyang, but Moscow as well, from the inside. In the end, China sees not a single strong rival on its perimeter, but a whole generation trying to build the same cheap asymmetry and the same cheap defense. South Korea's 500,000 operators are only the loudest piece of that regional picture. If that is the military equation, the second problem is quieter, but no less deep, and directly economic. China's real strength is often assumed to be its economy, yet on its own, that is a weak footing. Today, the undisputed giant of the civilian drone market is the Chinese company DJI. On its own, it holds roughly 70% of the global market and 90% of the consumer segment, with even 3/4 of the US market. Fed for years by state-backed industrial policy, that share is the product of a deliberate choice. So the answer to who controls the components, the supply chain, and the technology is, for now, largely Beijing. And what will decide the crises of the future is less the number of ships on the water than who holds this invisible infrastructure. This dominance is no accident, but the result of an ecosystem built over years. A drone's smallest yet most vital parts, tiny motors, sensors, cameras, batteries, come largely from the same supply network, and that chain is so competitive that the world has, in practice, become unable to build a drone without it. So for a country to build a China-free drone is not about swapping out a single part, it means rebuilding an entire chain. Costly, slow, and laborious. Costly, slow, and laborious. And the break is exactly here. Once the drone becomes everyone's most critical weapon, no one wants to leave that weapon's lifeline in a rival power's hands. Korea's decision to use 100% domestic parts is the proof, and the same decision, for the same reason, is being repeated across an entire region. Consider, if a country bears the extra cost of stripping the Chinese part out of its drone, it says two things at once. It acknowledges China's current strength, and it is deliberately trying to break away from it. And this break comes at the worst time for China. Just as global drone demand is seeing the fastest rise in its history, China's greatest lever is beginning to erode. And once the process starts, it feeds itself. As each country moves to China-free drones, suppliers and standards shift that way too, making it easier for the next one. Nor is this only about militaries. The drone is everywhere today, from agriculture to logistics, so this shift pulls in the civilian industry as well. Beijing is trying to turn its component edge into export controls, but once the China-free target is set, that pressure can slow the break, not stop it. One thing must be stated plainly. There is no war China is losing today, and it would be wrong to overstate this picture. China is not a passive party in this equation. It produces these drones itself, watches the Ukrainian battlefield closely, and can combine the same cheap drone logic on both offense and defense with its own enormous production scale. The door Ukraine opened is a door Beijing can pass through too. What we are seeing is not a one-sided collapse, but a mutual, open-ended race. And on South Korea's side, not everything is limitless either. Advanced as it is, it still depends on the United States for certain key technologies, and its defense industry is sometimes criticized for focusing too much on short-term wins. Two caveats are worth keeping in mind. Hellscape is still a concept, not a proven, definitive result on the battlefield, and its effectiveness is seriously debated. And South Korea's 500,000 drones are, above all, aimed at North Korea. The against China dimension is more a matter of component independence and a regional trend. So a reading like Korea has declared war on China would be wrong. The right picture is this: not something lost today, but a long-term balance that has quietly begun to shift, and the outcome of this race will be decided not by technology alone, but by industrial capacity, cost, alliances, and political will. A plain picture remains. Over the past 20 years, China accumulated two great cards: a massive, expensive conventional army to overawe its neighbors, and near monopoly control over the supply chain that produces the world's drones. The Ukrainian front, without meaning to, weakened both cards at once. But the real blow is not, as many assume, in the cheap attack drone. It is in the defense that stops those drones cheaply. Because a number is an advantage only when there is no wall to melt it, and everyone is now learning how to build that wall from Ukraine. Kim Jong-un relied on battlefield experience, Xi Jinping on numerical superiority. The real news out of Seoul is this: if the greatest military equalizer of the 21st century is a cheap attack drone, the thing that equalizes it will be a cheap defense. And South Korea is playing to become one of the countries best able to produce that defense. So will this defense wave actually push Beijing and Pyongyang back over time, or will China rebuild the balance with its own enormous production might? We will take that up in the next analysis. To not miss it, subscribing to the channel is enough.